Welcome, everyone, to Monuments to Movements Speakeasy Conversation Series, especially on today, International Women's Day. We're so glad to have you here. My name is Neysa Page-Lieberman. I'm the co-founder and artistic director of M2M, along with Jane Sachs, and we are thrilled to be joined today by Lawrence Bartley, Oswaldo Gomez, Teny Gross, and Gissou Nia to talk about movement making. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to what we call our forever invitation, because we ask this to everyone we meet in every setting that we work in. The invitation was on your intro slide and it's getting posted again now in chat. And we ask you to consider who your community is. And you can be super brief or you can write a lot. We just don't want you to feel like you have to write a lot. So we say 1 to 10 words. Just tell us who your community is as defined by your place, your history, your culture, your spirit, your identity, or however you define it. I'm going to ask Kelsey to share that question again, and we're just going to show you a couple examples to get you comfortable with answering this. So you can read those, and you can see some people really just ignore the 10 words and like to write a lot, and some people put in just 1 word. And so here's just a couple ways that people have answered it in the past. We're really looking forward to having you participate in this because we want to know who you are and where you're coming from. In M2M, we seek to shift the conversation around why, how, and who gets monumentalized. And we feel like most of us have not seen the story of our community represented in a public space. So that's why we do this exercise, to empower and encourage ourselves to imagine yours and mine and our monument and to enact it together. So later we'll post a second part of this prompt and we'll read some of our ideas together. Okay, thanks for screen sharing, Kelsey. I think you can take it down. Thank you so much. So welcome to SpeakEasy. If this is your first SpeakEasy, this is M2M's public conversation series where we discuss our current initiatives and related ideas with our collaborators. We kicked off a year ago, and this is now season 2. If you haven't seen our exciting spring lineup, grab the link that we're going to be putting in chat where you can view and register for upcoming programs. You'll also find a link to last season's highlight reel on YouTube where you can catch up on all of season 1 in under 15 minutes, thanks to the beautiful video editing wizardry of Kelsey, who wrapped up that whole season in a short reel. So just a couple housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program will be recorded and uploaded on YouTube, and you can also find it on our website. Chat is enabled, where we're going to be popping in links, as I mentioned, and where you're going to be introducing yourself through your community. We're also going to pop in a few other links related to work our panelists are doing. Live transcription is enabled. You can turn that on your own screen in the bottom of the Zoom window. And finally, when we get to the Q&A portion of today, please put your questions in the Q&A tool, not the chat tool. We'll be looking at Q&A when we pull those towards the end of the hour. So when we present public conversations, there's always many new people joining, and today is no different. A lot of you, this is the first time you're here. So it might also be your first introduction to Monuments to Movements. So a little bit about us. M2M is an international organization that envisions, develops, and commissions public artwork that monumentalizes movement making and collective action. Our team includes Marcela Andrade, Kelsey Bogdan, Josue Esau, and Aarya Malik, and an expansive international group of movement builders. M2M offers a new vision and an evolving process that is not just inclusive of the world's diversity, but also paradigm shifting, feminist, and centered in restorative justice. We're working on monuments about climate justice, evolving democracies, indigenous rights, a feminist seed bank, and much more. We commission essays that are personal monuments in themselves, called the Deeper Story series. And we've also created the first ever archive of public art about movement building, and that's just to name a few. So today's discussion is about movement making, movement makers, and large social shifts. M2M lives inside the power of this work, the multitudes of leaders and foot soldiers driving strategy and action. We describe a movement as a group unified by a vision to advance shared goals to influence culture, policies, social systems, and thought. We always say that movements are not neutral. They raise awareness and catalyze action with intention. They have enough velocity and mass that no one person or group is controlling or guiding it entirely, and thusly movements evolve over time. We value both the gift of the human being and the sustained power of the social movement. So my intro's wrapped up, and now I finally get to introduce our guests. So I'm going to start with Lawrence Bartley. Lawrence Bartley is a prison reform activist and a publisher for the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization focused on the U.S. criminal justice system. He heads the Marshall Project Inside, a publication specifically intended for incarcerated audiences. He is also the host and executive producer of Inside Story, a news and current affairs video series in partnership with Vice News that is made primarily by former prisoners and explores issues of crime, punishment, and the prison industry for incarcerated audiences and the public at large. Bartley is also the founder and director of News Inside, the award-winning print publication of the Marshall Project, which is distributed to more than 1,000 correctional facilities throughout the US. Beyond this, he has contributed multimedia content for numerous news outlets such as CNN, PBS, NBC Nightly News, MSNBC, and was part of the team behind the Zoe, winner of the 2021 Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence and Innovation, and a recipient of an Emmy nod in the area of news and documentaries. Thank you so much for being with us, Lawrence. Next is Oswaldo Gomez. Oswaldo Gomez is a community organizer who began his work in high school when he organized a student-led movement which fought to preserve schools that were facing the threat of closure in Chicago's Black and Brown neighborhoods. Since then, he has worked for the National Immigrant Justice Center's Child Protection Program and the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, advocating for detained immigrant youth. He's done community organizing around police accountability and public safety reforms through One Northside and the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability. Oswaldo played an integral role in the formation of the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Coalition, which seeks to democratize the public safety apparatus in Chicago. He continues that work by serving as the interim vice president of the city's Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability, the new oversight agency created by ECPS. He is also currently pursuing a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. Thank you for joining us, Oswaldo. Teny Gross. Teny Gross began his career working to build peace between Palestinians and Israelis as a member of the Israeli Defense Force. Today, Teny is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago, an organization that works closely with community, social services, and officials to combat violence through a combination of outreach, mediation, support, and nonviolence training. Before Teny was recruited to Chicago to aid in its violence reduction efforts, he was a street outreach worker in Boston and later founder and CEO for the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence in Providence, Rhode Island. The nonviolence model developed for the organization focused on Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent, beloved community ideal and was comprised of 5 programs: nonviolence training, statewide victims support services, street worker outreach, reentry, and education and employment. He holds a BFA from Tufts, an MTS from Harvard, and a fellowship in strategic perspectives and nonprofit management from Harvard Business School. Thank you, Teny, for being here with us today. Gissou Nia. Gissou Nia is a human rights lawyer and nonprofit leader. She's the director of the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council, which works on prevention and accountability efforts for atrocity crimes, human rights violations, terrorism, and corruption offenses. She serves as board chair of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, where she is helping develop and oversee the group's human rights advocacy and legal programs. She previously served as the executive director for the group and as the deputy director of the Center for Human Rights in Iran. Gissou started her career in The Hague, where she worked on war crimes and crimes against humanity trials at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Court. Most recently, she was a leader in the successful campaign to remove the Islamic Republic from the UN Commission on the Status of Women and continues to lecture and publish on global human rights developments and the rule of law in post-conflict and transitional societies. Gissou, thank you for joining us. Thank you all. So before we launch into Q&A, I'm going to see if we've gotten some answers to who is your community? Okay, so far I've got my community is people who are lifelong learners and seekers of more freedom and love in the world. My community is Chicagoans, those seeking climate justice, those seeking a responsible government that serves the people. So thank you for the ones that have entered so far. If you're continuing to put them in, I can't view it at this moment, but everyone else can. So let's keep introducing ourselves. It's a wonderful way to learn about our audience. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and share the second prompt. So once you've defined your community, we're now going to start thinking about a monument to our community. So the second prompt is describe what a monument to your community might be. Some prompts for that could be location, medium, representation, duration, mood. Anything that you want, anything that you think could monumentalize your community, your personal story, throw that in so we can continue to learn about each other. Okay, so now I get to pass the mic to Jane, who's going to take it over with Q&A. Okay, Jane, it's yours. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Neysa. While we're going to start the Q&A, I want everyone to keep dropping answers into the chat to the second prompt that Neysa just read out and was on the screen. And I would love for the panelists to keep thinking about what you might answer to those prompts too. I just want to start by saying that M2M is a movement of civic storytelling, visibility, agency, collective action, power, and equitable participation. And we do all of that through art with social impact. We're driven by the idea of creating new models of civic participation and social impact through great art and culture. And we believe that art and culture are inherently political. I don't think of there being political art and then art. And it's political because they push us to question and respond and reflect and risk and challenge, experiment, fail, liberate, and love. Let's not forget that. So you'll soon hear from some very inspiring individuals who are creating models, using strategies, and engaging communities on multiple issues in various ways. And today we're discussing what powers some of the most vital movements of our time: human rights and gender equity, prison reform, police accountability, anti-violence work in all its forms. And that, of course, is just to name a few. Today we celebrate International Women's Day, although we need more than a day, but so far we got that 24 hours, so let's use it well. And we want to acknowledge the many feminist strategies and practices and feminists that resonate in this conversation, including having autonomy over one's life and body and environment, practicing ethics of care, anti-violent resolutions to conflict and oppression, radical inclusivity, new models of leadership, power, and participation. You'll most likely identify more feminist practices throughout the conversation. And I can say feminism is everywhere, in every corner, and in every part of the globe. As we discover how to create monuments to movements, we also need to understand and explore what a movement is, how it's made, how it inspires impact, how it's maintained, how we commit to it, how we understand when we've succeeded or failed. And we must ask ourselves together, what is our vision of who we want to be in the near and far future, while engaging an authentic vision of ourselves in the present and in the past? Are we courageous enough to have this discussion and to work to get there together? I want to mention something that Teny said in a recent meeting we all had, and he said, we might be bridge builders between and among strategies and movements and systems. Sometimes we don't want to be part of a movement. We'd rather be doing something else. But we feel the responsibility because we recognize the void. So these are amazing void fillers, all of you. And I just want to start by asking a simple, uncomplicated question, which is, what is a movement to each of you? What does that look like? What does it feel like? How do you know you're in a movement? And we can start with you, Oswaldo.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks everyone for being here and for putting together this amazing panel. I'm so honored to be with such amazing movement builders. I'm going to start by defining a movement, maybe by not defining it, but maybe naming some of the characteristics that I see as a community organizer that make up movements, because it is something that is almost impossible to define. When I think of movements, I usually think of things that are multi-generational. And by that, I mean both that they have people of different generations participating in it, but also things that are ideas, messages, fights, desires, even histories and pain that is passed from one generation to the other. It's really not something that happens in any one moment. It's not something that maybe even happens in any one place, right? There's time that it seems to be ongoing across whatever movement that you look at. I think another important thing to mention is that when you think of movements, we oftentimes see them as being a global, or maybe being a push that's supported by thousands of people. But oftentimes movements start hyper locally. They start with a very few local people that are stepping into their fear and breaking from the shame or the pain that they're feeling. And really become really vocal despite competing interests or despite whatever the status quo might want them to be. So when I think of movement, I think of that being a part of the movement as well. A movement can be large, but a movement can also be really small. And because we tend to see them only in periods of time, we don't realize that movements go from being just a few people, maybe even one person or two people, that eventually build together enough community, enough networks, enough support, and then create something that transcends times and generation. One caveat that I'll say about movements, movements are not campaigns, right? And this is something that I think a lot of people struggle with. Movements are not legitimized by political institutions. They're not legitimized by nonprofit organizations. They're not legitimized by anything other than the people that are carrying them and that are putting in their time and donating their energy to them. So in that way, when we think of movements, let's think of them as something that is really expanding between generations and expanding between different time periods.
And powered by people, 3 to 3 million. Hey, Teny, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So movements can be, in my biased opinion, also positive and negative. So we see a movement that January 6th stormed the Capitol. That's a movement.
Mm-hmm.
The Nazis were a movement, very costly to other people. So ideas galvanized with energy of people and trying to address injustice or perceived injustice. I always think of it a bit like waves. And maybe the Seamus Heaney quote of double take, that every so often suddenly there's a larger wave that comes. So when you look at the civil rights movement, it really came on the heels of, yes, today's is appropriate. A lot of women organizing in churches in the South, and not just women, but a lot of people who were not well known. Some became a little bit more well known, like Ella J. Baker, etc. But suddenly, many small waves or energies in the water catch up to a more massive waves, but waves have a limited amount of energy, right? They can carry a certain way, but then we got to restart. Michelle Alexander said that the history of America is progress and a backlash. And well, we had Obama as a president. On one level, it seemed like a progress, and wow, what did we have since? Right, almost to unrecognizable countries. So In my case of outreach and violence reduction, 34 years of work, initially we started, there was no legitimacy for people who have a background to do peace work, right? It was all policing all the time, was hitting people with batons. We were out on the streets, and in front of us, the police would go through pockets of young men, especially young men, and sometimes movements, and as the movement moves on and even sometimes gets stronger, more radical, sometimes the progress that has been made is actually not recognized. I was at a meeting at John Jay a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, where ACLU organizations from the East and West Coast were really challenging reformers, but they didn't really bother to see the history of change that brought a lot of violence down and saved a lot of Black and brown lives. So there's complexity within movement. Also being an Israeli at some point, we had the vast majority of Israelis and Palestinians on the side of a compromise and peace movement, and those waves collapsed. And there's now a bit of an rising again because the constitution, we don't have a constitution, but what the prime minister is trying to do and put all at risk. But otherwise, the peace movement in Israel has been decimated in many, many ways. So there's no guarantees, in a way like a novel, how this is going to end, how the stories end. Just because you work on the right side, you need to have hope. You need to hope to win. You don't always win. And you got to recognize you pass the baton, in my case, to younger people, and just support them and make sure we also learn the history a bit of our movements.
Thank you. Thank you. It really does fold into another question that we have been thinking about, which is, how do you go from feeling an injustice or a void to developing strategies in a movement? And you're talking about that. But also it's like, what isn't visible, right? I mean, obviously in the United States, one of the big famous examples is, Rosa Parks. She just was tired that day. She just didn't get a good night's sleep and she was tired. And of course, that is not. She was an incredibly fierce and dedicated, comrade in the struggle. And so I think also this idea of like, what that groundswell looks like and what's happening, right? And when does it appear? Gissou, do you want to talk a little bit about how you define a movement, and also this idea of, when you see and feel it, and then when it becomes a movement, kind of what Oswaldo and Teny are talking about in terms of waves?
Yeah, I think in my work, the movements are often built out of absolute necessity. So I focus a lot on human rights violations around the world, and definitely in Iran. I'm Iranian American and can speak the language and have been working with victim and survivor communities there for more than a decade now. And so there it's often similar to, I think, where movements start everywhere. It's really born out of a need. And the position that I and my colleagues who are lawyers or, human rights strategists would play is trying to bridge the gap between those desires and that people power and what the things are that they wish to achieve and operationalize it in a way. So look for the gaps in law that exist that are not allowing for that community to get the justice and accountability they desire, or not allowing them to prevent the abuses they're trying to prevent. So I think there's the people power side of it, which is how I often look at a movement, but then there's the sort of operationalizing it and strategizing around how we can best get from point A to B all the way to Z. And that requires, obviously, the people at the core who have their core demand. So the movements that in my mind are never successful are these manufactured, or they're not authentic. They're these like manufactured strategic campaigns where somebody just decided, well, this is something that we think we want to do. We want to do a campaign on this. You see that a lot in the corporate space when corporations sort of jump on different issues and then start to attach themselves to things that they think should happen. And you can feel how inorganic and inauthentic that is, because it wasn't actually tied to any demand of a community. It wasn't tied to just conversations you're having with people who've been subjected to violations or some kind of treatment that they wish to resolve. But there's a people side of it, there's a strategy side. If you only have the strategy side, or you have people just kind of picking out a whole cloth what they think should happen because they thought it sounded nice or they think it's good for social impact, then it's not going to go anywhere, in my view. So I guess that's how I would define a movement, just looking at the logistics and the pieces. And then, of course, I think already everybody has spoken to this, but it's really about the spirit of things. So movements are only as successful as people honestly have the desire for something. And for that, you also need, it can start with a few people and slow burn and create a mass movement if others recognize that they also wish for the same. But if without like mass support and without people really agreeing on this and thinking it's something important for them, it's not going to go the distance. So I guess it's a bit of rambling thoughts about what I think a movement is, but that's the way I would view a movement, at least in my work and what I've seen and what has been successful in reaching the goals that communities wish to reach.
I mean, not rambling at all. And I love how there's the organic and then the strategy and, how it's going to roll out, right? And the operation. So it's not just, the heart and we want to change this, but that combination of the organic, which is not controllable, not forcible, and then saying, okay, and then we come up with a strategy and where are the weak points to actually find where we can, have the movement take hold. Lawrence?
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, I'm coming from a different position than most here. The way I see movement is as basically a collective action to bring about change. Us at the Marshall Project, usually people who associated movements are usually thought of as advocates. But us as the Marshall Project, we aren't advocates, we're journalists. But our mission is to create a sort of a movement. And that movement is to create a sense of urgency around a criminal justice system and to sustain it, because there haven't been many news organizations that focused on criminal justice to the degree that we have. And there haven't been any who focused on the incarcerated population, not just to write about them, but to write for them. And we see ourselves as the oxygen for advocates that fuel movements, the people that really care about the movements and sustain it going all the way through. And we've done that in many instances, following, what happened with the George Floyd. But we reported about, we did a series called Maul, about the dog bites, from police dog bites that go unnoticed, but they happen more times than people are shot by police. And we won a Pulitzer Prize for that series. We did one about language, the Language Project, the way people are referred to. Many people in journalism, in fact, refer to incarcerated people as inmates. And that's offensive to many incarcerated people. So we published a series that highlighted the humanizing language like incarcerated person or person in prison, etc. And other organizations have been doing it before us, but there's those who have seen our story have been doing it after us. So we kind of pushed that movement and humanizing language forward. And I have many more examples, but that's just the way I see it from a journalism standpoint.
Well, I think there's a long history of language, the use of words, really taking that back. Obviously, like as a queer person, that the pink triangle became a symbol, but it was, Hitler's Nazis who used that symbol, right? And so language and symbols and the way we communicate, also who learns about what's happening and what that means to them. We know knowledge is power, right? And so that is really part of it. For me, growing up in Chicago, the Chicago Reporter was one of the main ways that people really found out about a lot of things in the equity and civil rights movement through, passing it along on trains, right? And so, would you say a train is essential for a movement? Well, depends on what you're using the train for. If you're carting off people to kill them, that is a movement, as Teny would say, but if you're using them for oxygen. So I think and I guess I would also offer that there has been, I don't know if I could call it a revolution, but I kind of feel it that in journalism, who gets to speak about what is important, the faces of who are gathering information and writing and dispersing it has drastically changed. And that has drastically changed what we read and what we know. So let me move on to global movements and how they're different than local collective action. At Project Dan, we work a lot on LGBT rights in East Africa. We work with South Africa a lot about freedom of voice. We are working in Philippines and also like in the DRC about gender violence. And it's a very different model and way of participating. And so I'm wondering, what's the role of outsiders in supporting movements happening elsewhere? And I thought maybe I would just ask this to Gissou and Teny because of your direct experience. Gissou?
Am I going first? Okay. Didn't want to jump. In terms of working with those who are outside the movement.
Well, and even outside, one of the things that you had been talking about is the difference between being on the inside as opposed to working on the outside and supporting a movement in a physical location or legal location or, any other kind of difference,
Yeah.
not centered to it.
This is something that comes up often with the campaigns that I run. It wouldn't always be relevant if you live in a society that allows freedom of expression, association, and assembly. But when you're dealing with closed societies that don't allow for that, even if they have signed on to conventions that allow for those rights, it's, when I'm dealing with campaigns, so for example, Iran. Dealing with campaigns in Iran or even dealing with campaigns. So today we have a campaign that just launched about Iran and Afghanistan, and it is to call on interpreting apartheid to include gender apartheid. I won't get into all the legal weeds of it, but this is a joint campaign between Iranian and Afghan women, and some of the signatories very bravely signed on from inside the country. And they do that really at risk of imprisonment, custodial torture, and even death, because they could be executed for such an act of what is perceived to be dissent by the state. And so the way I view the role of people outside of those closed societies in a place where they are free to say what they want to say and where they don't have to be cautious about, expressing themselves. Our role is really to amplify the demands of the communities that are asking for things and are not in a position to be able to do it. So for example, if we need to go to the United Nations, which is located in New York or Geneva, and go and advocate with member states, and that's something that could maybe be done virtually, but historically typically isn't done virtually. There was only like a brief window during the COVID pandemic where they were allowing for that. And also where even a virtual connection would be a problem, because if you're having these kinds of conversations and there's state surveillance, you're not going to be safe. You may be in a state where there's often internet shutdowns, so the connection is also throttled or non-existent. So therefore, there are ambassadors for those causes that might be doing that out on the outside. And they could be part of the community, but part of a community that is maybe living in exile. So some of our fiercest advocates on these issues are recently exiled journalists, activists, lawyers who simply could not do their work in country anymore because it was just too unsafe for them, because they were in and out of jail, because their family was facing retaliation and they were having to put up the deeds to their house to be able to get out on bail. So that's the way I see the role of the outside, being able to amplify what the demands of a community on the inside of a closed society are, making sure that they're never ahead of them in that they are just walking alongside them and making sure that the demands are being accurately conveyed. And the other part of that is just the role of the international community. So too often, I think there's this view that either multilateral institutions like the United Nations or different governments who want to orient their foreign policy around something, too often there's a view that somehow, that's interventionist somehow. And I think the important point here is that a lot of the alleged perpetrators and a lot of the people that are committing these actions that we are fighting against in closed societies, they all benefit from an international globalized system. They store their assets that they've gained through corruption and off the backs of human rights violations and bank accounts in Switzerland, the UK, France, so they really benefit from that system. And so there really is no way to kind of piece this as these are just internal matters or not internal matters. They benefit from the global community in their own to facilitate their financial corruption and to facilitate the lifeline of their human rights abusing regimes. So we also expect the international community to have a response to that and to cut off those monetary flows and to ensure that that doesn't continue.
Yeah, I think those are really important and interesting points. I think people are becoming more and more aware of how things are connected, and not just through like technology, right? But with the invasion of Ukraine, what does that mean in terms of grain supply and food? And people are starving tens of thousands of miles away because of the invasion from Russia, and understanding what that means. I also think it gets inverted sometimes. When we are working in the DRC with gender-based violence survivors, and we did this huge photographic exhibit that we created with the UN, the women wanted to show their faces. And some of the men said, we can't do that. We can't let them show their faces. It will be so dangerous for them. And so it became an issue of agency and power, that they were willing to take that risk because they wanted to have more impact on the movement, and how people outside were, trying to protect them in a way that was really inappropriate. Teny, do you have anything to add?
I think in Israel, at the time of after the Oslo Agreement, there was discussion that a lot of people in the peace movement were really influenced by American Jews. I remember working at Harvard on a project on Jerusalem, and me being an Israeli and my Palestinian colleague, we were much more willing to compromise than an American Jew from Florida and a Pakistani. And we told them, when you send your kids to the struggle, you can tell us not to compromise, but we who take the brunt of the conflict, we want to compromise. So sometimes outside forces actually more extreme than people who are living in the conflict. Same goes here in the city. At the moment, we're facing an election, and it's interesting to see how people who are not living in highly impacted neighborhoods are absolutely advocating for more police and are hiring security companies, because I'm being facetious a little bit, because they're on Citizens app and everything looks like they're in an absolutely insane city, but they're actually not being hurt that much. I don't want to minimize it when they are getting hurt, but there's nothing like the neighborhoods that are being impacted. Yet the voices of what should be the prescription is outsized. So, and then on being an ally, right? I'm an ally. I'm not an African-American working, been for 30 years. I'm part of the Live Free USA movement, and I helped to participate in starting, and I love it. But it is also important to be an ally. For me, from the Holocaust, I grew up pretty angry at Europeans and Christians because I thought all of them sold us out. It wasn't just the Nazis. My grandmother was killed in Zagreb by the collaborators with the Nazis, Croatians. I had to come to peace that there were many people who did risk their life to save Jews, and we cannot be a bystander. This is the violence we have in the United States is created by us, the majority, and we cannot be a bystander. At the same time, you got to negotiate and be very conscious that you're not overwhelming and actually at the service of those who are most impacted. And that's a delicate balance. It shifts and changes. I don't think before I pass away that I will ever figure it out. You just try to be very sensitive and conscious about it.
Thank you. I just want to ask Oswaldo if you want to just jump in before I go to another question, because there can be insiders and outsiders that supposedly speak the same language, have the same, zip code, telephone area code, time zone, and yet there are these really significant divisions. And for the work you're doing in terms of police reform, you're right in the center of also what Teny's talking about.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, and who's an outsider and who's an insider, I think is mostly helpful for strategic reasons when you're thinking about who needs to get involved where. I think one thing that's worth remembering is that in some way, all of us are benefactors of some system, right? And for example, for me, in the work that I've been doing with unaccompanied migrant children, I see me as someone who lives in the US often benefiting from the, environmental catastrophe that we're causing in Central America. I think in the work that I do locally, I'm oftentimes not seen as a benefactor of that, right? But what I think can be helpful to remember is that it is a matter of being participants, and allies are oftentimes benefactors of something. And as such, they also need to take on responsibilities. I'll tell you that from my organizing toolkit, one of the most powerful things that we oftentimes think about is who can we bring that will be standing with us, right? The people that are most impacted, the brown and Black folks that are most impacted by policing, who can get us in the room, right? Who's going to be the person that is willing to sort of cross the line because they're a little bit safer than we would be. And that's huge. And I think a lot of people sort of underestimate how strategic and how impactful that can be. It's not just the citizen obsessed folks that feel that they are the victim when in reality they are the benefactors. I think there are definitely people that are willing to put their privilege on the line for someone else. And I think that's something that we all need to reflect on, because like I said, I think we're all benefactors of some system that puts people in harm's way for our betterment, for our sustenance, for our subsistence. So I think overall the division of insiders and outsiders can be exploited for strategic benefit, but it's also important to not let that division, as Teny said, be something that inhibits compromise, because even in radical organizing spaces, people are very unwilling to compromise, even if they have the same exact goal. And that's something I definitely have had to do a lot of work on.
Well, and that's a great addition to the conversation, and it actually leads me to another question, which is really about, political scientists are talking now about how proximity actually is a huge influence on people across the world. What countries you're closest to, what information, who you meet. I mean, they talk about during the civil rights movement that it was usually groups of friends. And had they not been close friends, they wouldn't have felt comfortable taking the kind of risky action that they did. So that's proximity too. And so I want to start with you, Lawrence, just to talk about your personal proximity to the work you do, and how it's impacted how you are involved in the work that you do, how you approach it and what you think is valuable and necessary.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I was incarcerated when I was 17, and I remained in prison for 27 years. And growing up in prison was very tough. It was so for many of the obvious reasons that, people hear on TV that prison is, some of that is fact, some of it is fiction, but it was tough nonetheless. But one of the less obvious downsides of being in prison is the lack of access to information. People in prison on average max out at making 52 cents an hour, working 40 hours a week. But there are many states where people make nothing at all. So they can't afford a pricey magazine subscription, newspaper subscription, so or a book to get information. But then they have family members who maybe can't afford it. But most people incarcerated come from either low income or working class communities. So their family members really can't afford that much. But those who can, and they get those items sent in, they are heavily screened by the prison administrators. There could be something on page 1 that's objectionable to a prison administrator that is subjective in reviewing the content, and that will cause the whole magazine or book to not get in prison. Teny just mentioned Michelle Alexander, her book, The New Jim Crow. In many places, they're not even allowed in prisons and jails. So that's tough there. But then if you add the fact that many prisons are located in rural areas is not a strong television signal where people can pick up some of the programs that you're used to. So an incarcerated person has to rely on the kindness of prison administrators to pay for cable. That's very tough to come by. And if they can't get that kindness, they have to come up with creative ways that an institution can improve for them to pay for cable themselves. So I set all that up to say it's very tough to get information in prisons. And for me, what kept me sane during my time in prison was learning, was seeking information out, reading, and trying to play with ideas in my head and try to act them out in the confines of a prison institution. So I knew how important that was. So when I was released, I created a print publication called News Inside that would be free of charge and free of all the hassle that I just explained for incarcerated people. And it's distributed in over 1,000 prisons and jails in the US. And most recently, I created Inside Story, which is a video series for people in prisons and jails who may have some literacy issues or who would prefer to get their news from television as opposed to reading it. And it's very essential to incarcerated people's lives. For instance, there's stories that incarcerated people write themselves, and we pay them to write it, and then we actually animate it, and you might see it in a series. And for them to see their work animated or see investigation that's done by our reporters, like a year-long investigation about an issue that they were dealing with that was pivotal for them to prove in their innocence, that's very valuable to an individual in prisons and jails. And it's because of my proximity to the issue, living it, being there myself, it had me go about the work in a way that people in prisons and jails kind of pump their fists and say, that's the reality that I'm talking about, that I don't see the typical news anchor discuss, I don't see covered. And it's something that I kind of hang my hat on, and it helps me going forward in a very impactful way.
No, that's a very moving story, not only experiencing incarceration for so much of your young life and young adult life, but also it's something, and it's kind of a secret, it's a project I'm working on, so don't tell anybody. But I'm really interested in the incarcerated mind and how our society actually builds systems for that. Obviously, being incarcerated it's a perfect example, right? But there's many states that make sure that you don't know and learn and access. But it's not just Saudi Arabia, or Iran. Like, thinking about living in the United States and what people know and what they don't, and how it actually starts to incarcerate our minds. So look out for that. It's going to be an M2M project. I'm going to ask, just because art and culture, journalism, media have been so instrumental to movements. They breathe life into movements, and throughout history, they have been at the center of evolutions and revolutions. So I'm wondering, have you experienced or been involved in a creative practice that has impacted on a movement, or you've seen a movement that's been impacted by it, or you think about that as a tool to the work that you're doing?
That question for me?
No, we could start with you, or we could move to somebody else and give you a little time to, catch your breath.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's up to you.
Okay, why don't you give us an answer, and then
Well,
we can
yes.
go around to everybody else.
A colleague of mine named Christy Thompson reported on a story about this new prison that was built in Illinois. It's called Thompson Prison. It was intended to be one of the safest and most modern prisons in the country. Senator Dick Durbin touted it as such, and this prison came out, but it wasn't staffed correctly. Staff weren't paid correctly. So when staff isn't paid correctly, that's less people working. When there's less people working, there's more stress on correction officers who are working to do their jobs. And that stress can sometimes translate into unethical practices that cause incarcerated people to lose their lives by the way they're shackled and they're chained. And it reminds me of another facility I went in recently where it had the same problem, that the individuals who were incarcerated, because it was low staff, there was no yard, no recreation. So one guy told me he haven't seen sunlight in 12 years. And in this same institution, and this back to Thompson Institution, it was something similar where because of lack of staffing issues, certain programs, certain movements weren't happening, and people would double bunk with two people in a cell, and frustrations run over and angst run over, and people would get into violent clashes and losing their lives, incarcerated people. So we reported on that story, and it received a lot of attention from the Department of Justice. For Inside Story, we just recently we did a segment on that as well. And just recently, a section of Thompson was closed within the last 3 weeks because of that. So when you report a story like that, sometimes it has some impact that everyone can feel.
Thank you. That has been a really important development in your role. All of you really had a lot to do with that shift. Teny or Oswaldo or Gissou, the role of art, culture, medium.
I'll be quick on this. So I think it's been mentioned a few times that I'm an organizer, and I'll say something about just how powerful art and culture and things like that are to us organizers. We oftentimes, and there are some people that can, play both roles, and props to them, as community organizers, as people that actually activate and build relationships across similarly minded, similarly impacted people. We oftentimes are not the ones creating art. We oftentimes are like utilizing and exploiting the benefits of art to activate people, right? The first time I went to a protest was because I saw a poster that I didn't understand, but that was cool. The first time that I understood about some of the movements that have existed in the world were because I was listening to music. And so I think we as people that are organizers, as people that are focused on how to activate people, how to engage them, how to bring them together, and where to find them, artists are so impactful in the work that we do. And again, some people can do both roles. My creative endeavors are not good enough to make them public, but I do think that people that are able to use art and expression do great service to movements. And it's not just the archiving of movements, like I said, that happens in so much of the work. It's also the real time creation of things that are painful, that can be hard, that can be propaganda, right? All those things are impactful. And thinkers and movement builders exploit them. There's a reason why so many protests happen, around statues, because those things are in conversation and people want to be in conversation. And so I think as movement thinkers, we need to think about what are the vehicles of gathering that include art and that include expression. Because I'm always thinking about that. And I'll tell you that I found a lot of amazing people to organize because we were at concerts together or because we were at an art show together, right? And we are able to use those connections to find one another.
I mean, that brings up such a point because M2M is so much about art and culture and a social impact and Project Dan, but then also this idea of the role of the public has a huge impact on the work that we all do. Gissou, do you want to jump in?
So the role of art and culture, I found that actually, I'll give a quick example of how I've seen how it can directly influence something. So there have been protests in Iran against the government on a recurring basis since December 2017. And during November 2019, when there was a very violent crackdown by the state on peaceful protesters and a reported 1,500 people were killed in the space of a few days, that was really serious, but there wasn't that much attention on it globally. Since mid-September, when there have been protests in the country, it was sparked because of the tragic killing of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who had allegedly defied the, mandatory hijab laws in the country, had been taken into the custody of the Islamic Republic's so-called morality police, which basically polices women's dress and ensures that they're in complying with hijab. And for that, she ultimately died. There were photos of her in a coma, bruised and battered with an oxygen mask to help her breathe over her nose, juxtaposed against a beautiful photo of her without her mandatory hijab and just full of life and vibrant. And this went viral. And it caused people to go out onto the streets. And so the core of these protests were really anger that this woman had been killed over maybe a few strands of hair. So it's really about human rights at its core. But the protest art that came out of it and the visuals, the fact that women were taking scissors and cutting their hair in mass protests in the country, and those videos were being spread, the fact that women were burning their mandatory hijabs and bonfires, basically saying like, we want our choice. All of that really lent itself very strongly to beautiful, compelling visuals that were all about freedom. And we found that there was such a stronger global outpouring of support, solidarity, when those visuals were really at the core. And we didn't have that with prior protests, even though those were centered around anti-government slogans all the same, and we're still centered around those core demands for change. So I think just in real time, you see how the power of art can really carry a message, can make people want to be part of a movement. It can speak to people in a way that's different than words, which can seem really sanitized or really academic or really clinical. So I think it plays a really core role, actually.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a true believer from probably in vitro, since my mother is my model in protests and cultural impact. But I often say that, when you need blood and sandbags and water and lifelines, you don't call in art, but it's the second responder. It's not the first, it's the second, because it's when we understand our humanity and we get to actually question things and get involved in a way that is open to everybody, right? I mean, art can be the most democratic tool, like it delivers on that promise of you too can enter into it. I remember being in Beirut during the uprising, and everybody was in a huge square singing Baby Shark. And there are these huge videos, and then, DJs playing music and everyone dancing. I mean, before it turned really, really violent. But Teny, do you want to wrap this up? And then Neysa's gonna ask another question and give the answers to the prompts.
To me, a few things come to mind is Roy de Carava was one of the first books I stumbled into a library. I went to the museum school in Boston, and just the tone just the simple fact how he did true to tone to black skin for his photography and the beauty of them. And then Danny Lyons, who is a University of Chicago graduate, but was the first photographer of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. I was just stunned. I was 23, I think, at the courage of the civil rights SNCC, of particularly the young people, and compared to I just came from serving in an army with had a weapon, right? So they did that without. I was just, it's both kind of a little bit shaming, but also made me reassess what courage is. And then finally, maybe 10 years ago, I was advising some groups here in Chicago. I was living on the East Coast about violence, and I stepped at the end of the 2 days into the Art Institute, I believe, and an Iranian artist, Shirin Nishat, there was this men choir, and it was amazingly beautiful. They were all men. And suddenly there was a voice behind, and you look back and it's actually a single woman singing. And that was one of the most impactful art pieces I've seen in the last 20 years. It just, it sent a message, really, the oppression of tradition versus someone who's trying to fight against that. And yeah, so art, I taught photography to young people who were incarcerated. That's how I started. We brought in then judges, probation officers to see the talent they're locking away. And it has a lot of power when you tell your own story.
Yeah, I think also just what you're saying, second responder, you would have never felt that in any other way than standing in Shireen in the middle of her pieces, and she commands the whole environment, as well as how it uses pretty much all of your senses. I'll just quote Albie Sachs, who is one of the great ANC lawyers and leaders, and then was brought back to co-write the Constitution by Mandela, and then was appointed to as a judge. And he says, art is what brought me in to the struggle. It's not that I brought art into it. And he really notes Pablo Neruda's poems about blood in the streets. So thank you all. I'm going to hand it over to Neysa to mention some of the answers people wrote about what their monuments might look like, and then also to kind of wrap up with one more big question for all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. I just wanted to briefly follow up on what Gissou was talking about with the really incredible, impactful, moving work that came up, creative gestures that came up around the women-led revolution in Iran and in allied communities all over the world. We have an archive that we built that we started right when we launched M2M a year and a half ago. We started building an archive of monuments to movements. And we're always looking kind of everywhere, and it's crowdsourced. Anybody can enter things. And back in September, we kind of stopped everything we were doing to focus on the work coming out of Iran and in support of that. So, you know, things that were happening in the street then live, you know, led by young girls and women and allies. Right here in Kansas City, I was driving down the street one day and saw a gorgeous mural in support of the movement. You know, there were really iconic things that happened, like in the middle of the Guggenheim, right? There was an impromptu protest there, and it raised so much awareness. And so if you look in our archive, maybe Josue can pop a link into our archive, or for people watching later, you can find it on our website. We have a series of these works, and people have been sending them to us on Instagram, and it's really helped, I think, kind of spread awareness and build support, and help other people with creative practices that intersect with activism, see the ways that they can contribute to this movement. So I think we only have a few minutes left, so I might not ask another question because I want to give some time to the beautiful responses that have been coming in. So our first prompt, which was to define your community, listen to some of these. So community to me is a feeling. It feels like support and understanding, openness and acceptance. Community for me is climate and justice, medical education, curiosity, compassion, and action. For me, community is the Black community, the artist community, the conscious spiritual community, the Harlem community, the human community. My community is my neighbors, friends, my family, coworkers, Torontonians, and also Iranians in the diaspora. My community includes all those I share an intersection with and all those I don't share any identity traits with, but choose to interact, support, and receive support from. My community, age, stimulation of social, political, emotional, intellectual activity. And here's some monuments. A monument lives and breathes and holds space for the community it lives in. The community and the monument should be in constant conversation, should hear its people, and should nurture and pay homage to the land it sits on. My monument is furry, glitter, wonder, enchanted safe space. My monument is success to gather, where stories are shared, where humanity is honored, there's food and music and laughter. Our best monument is a sustained movement with which equitably and justly engages and is led by Chicagoans for healthy, flourishing communities prepared for our climate future. So I want to thank everyone so much for contributing to what we feel is such an important invitation and part of our movement building in Monuments to Movements. We so strongly believe in all of our rights to tell our own stories and monumentalize our community's history, story, purpose, vision, hopes, desires in public spaces. So as we are finishing up, I just want to point out a couple things. So our next speakeasy is on the play as Monument, the theatrical play as Monument. It's on April 19th. It's in collaboration with Kansas City Repertory Theater. I say the shorthand here in Kansas City, featuring playwrights, performers, and theater artists, Kate Hamill, Mary Catherine Nagel, and Daniel Alexander Jones. We also want to invite you to follow us on Instagram. We would love if you join our mailing list. We would love if you would fill out a post-event survey so we can learn a little bit more about you, how you heard from us, what else you'd like us to talk about, or how you may want to engage in this work and work with us. And then finally, of course, I want to thank our extraordinary panelists for joining us today. It's been such a privilege and a heart-opening experience for me, and I know that I speak on behalf of Jane as well. So thank you for coming, and thank you for our audience for participating and expanding this conversation with us. We hope to see you again soon.